So this is the second part of the speed versus velocity video. It got a little bit long, so we're going to go ahead and continue here. We're going to talk about average velocity in this video. So average velocity or average speed is going to be your velocity or your speed over an entire trip. Individually during the trip, you might go 60 miles per hour or 90 miles per hour or 10 miles per hour or stop at different parts. But over the entire trip, how fast were you? That's your average velocity. The equations for average speed and average velocity are the ones that we've been using. So we've actually been talking about average velocity and average speed. So average speed's equation would be the total distance divided by the total time, which is what we've been doing. And so writing it just speed is equal to distance divided by time is perfectly fine. So for average velocity, it's the exact same thing we've been doing. The change in position divided by the change in time, displacement divided by time. Change in position is the final position minus the initial position. And if you have a time interval, you can use that. Or if you have the final time and the initial time, you can subtract them. So these are the same equations we've been using. So let's go ahead and do an example. Gus leaves his house and walks 1,200 meters due north to his friend Greg's house in 10 minutes. He stays there for half an hour, then returns home the 1,200 meters, though it takes him 13 minutes this time. What was his average speed and his average velocity? Now notice here we have several parts to this trip again. So Gus is going to leave his house and walk 1,200 meters due north. Takes him 10 minutes to do that. He's going to stay there for half an hour. So 30 minutes stopped. And then he returns home the 1,200 meters. But this time it takes him 13 minutes. So average speed is distance divided by time. Well, what was his distances? He went 1,200 meters and then came back 1,200 meters. And so that's 2,400 meters. So it took him 10 minutes, and then he stopped for 30 minutes, and then it took him 13 minutes, which is 53 minutes. So 53 minutes is going to be, we're going to multiply that by 60 to get it in seconds. We'll get this into meters per second. So 53 times 60 is 3180, so that many seconds is what we're going to use. And so our speed ends up being 0.7547, so 0.75 meters per second. Now velocity, let's think about this. Velocity is going to be the change in position divided by time. His initial position was here at his house. He went up and then he came back to his house. So his initial position was 0 and his final position was 0. There was no change in position from initial to final. So it doesn't matter that it was 3180 seconds. In terms of velocity, he never went anywhere. His average velocity for that trip was 0 meters per second. So he had velocity in parts of the trip, but over his entire trip, his average velocity was 0 meters per second. Again, speed and velocity are not the same thing. Sometimes we can use them interchangeably, but you have to recognize the difference. Okay, we're going to do one last example, and this one is a little bit of a tricky example. So Sarah moves for 30 seconds at a velocity of 5 meters per second, then for 20 seconds at 6 meters per second, and then for 45 seconds at 4 meters per second. What's our average velocity? We're not going to worry about average speed. Let's just talk about average velocity in this. Now, let's see. She had a velocity of 5 meters per second, and then she also had a velocity of 6 meters per second, and then 4 meters per second. And average, you just take the 3 and add them together and divide by 3, right? So 6 plus 5 plus 4 divided by 3 is 15 divided by 3, which is equal to 5 meters per second. So this should be her average velocity, right? Wrong, because she didn't go that way. So if I went to Austin and I drove 90 miles per hour for 50 of the miles and then got stuck in traffic and went 2 miles per hour for the last 10 miles, then my average velocity is not the average of 90 and 2, because most of the trip I went 90 miles per hour. Now, going 2 miles per hour for some of the trip is going to bring my average down, but not so much that it's going to be an average of the two, because I went for 90 miles per hour for a lot more of the trip. So when you're doing average velocity, remember that your average velocity is your change in position divided by your change in time. So we actually need to know the change in position for each of these. So there are 3 sections to this trip. So we'll call part 1, part 2, and then part 3. So during part 1, we went 5 meters per second for 30 seconds. So we figured out earlier that displacement was equal to velocity times time. So we're going to have to do that 5 times 30 seconds, which gives us 150 meters. During part 2, we have 20 seconds for 6 meters per second. 6 times 20 is 120 meters. And part 3, we're going to do velocity times time. And our velocity was 4 meters per second times 45 seconds, which is 180 meters. So throughout this whole trip, our change in position was equal to 150 plus 120 plus 180. They're all in the same direction. It didn't say anything went backwards. So we just add those up, and that gives us 450 meters divided by my change in time. Well, my total time was 30 plus 20 plus 45, which is 95 seconds. So I'm going to do 450 divided by 95. And 450 divided by 95 is 4.736, so 4.74 meters per second. Now, we had thought that the average of those was going to be 5, but it's less than that because we spent more time going 4 meters per second, so it brought our average down. And I'm very sorry that everything disappeared when I accidentally hit that button, but you can take the video back if you need to see what was written before. Okay, so that was a whole lot about speed and velocity and the difference between the two, and how to figure out average velocity, and hopefully that helped and you can work the problems that you need to work now.